Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and completely reframe how we look at one of the oldest and honestly most misunderstood medical frameworks in human history. Today, we're going to bypass all the myths, the magic, and the mystery, and we're going to understand simply TCM for what it originally was, which is incredibly an advanced, systems level observation of human life.
Look, I want to start by just validating your confusion for a second. If you've ever looked at traditional Chinese medicine and found it to be just full of impenetrable jargon and completely fragmented theories, you are absolutely not alone. I mean, even modern students of the practice often feel like they're trying to learn 10 different languages all at the exact same time. You'll read one text that tells you one thing, and then a totally different historical school tells you the exact opposite. But what if I told you that this confusion isn't a bug in the system? It's actually a feature of its incredibly long history. All right, let's jump into section 1, the problem with modern TCM, lost in translation.
So, the really crucial point here is that this immense complexity isn't a flaw. It's really just a natural result of historical information transmission. It's entropy. Think about it kind of like a drop of ink hitting a glass of water, right? It starts as this single, super dense point of observation, early humans just noticing very basic natural rhythms. But over thousands of years, as those observations had to be recorded and taught and applied in the real world, they required terminology. Direct experience turned into concepts. Then, concepts built systems. And eventually, those systems fractured into all these rival schools of thought. That entropy basically means that the modern learner is dealing with a highly fragmented, incredibly complex web of terminology that completely obscures the original, beautifully simple observations.
Moving on to section 2, two ways to see life, dismantling versus observing. To really get this, we have to look at the massive difference between our two primary medical lenses. On the left side, modern Western medicine is totally built on reductionism. It is all about spatial dismantling. We want to know exactly how the body works, right? So we break it apart into smaller and smaller pieces. We go from organs to tissues to cells down to molecules and genes. And it's incredibly, wonderfully precise. But over on the right, we have TCM, which operates on systems theory. It doesn't break the body apart to see the individual pieces. Instead, it observes the entire system's dynamic flow without breaking it at all. It looks at the body over time, focusing on how all those parts relate to one another to maintain an overall balance. Let's consider the concept of the black box for a minute. You have to remember, before the 16th century, you couldn't exactly cut a living person open safely to check out their cellular mechanisms. At least, not if you wanted them to actually stay alive. So, how do you fix a highly complex machine that you literally cannot open? Well, you monitor the inputs and the outputs. You tweak the inputs, things like diet, environment, or herbal medicine, and then you very, very carefully observe the outputs. We're talking physical symptoms, pulse waves, tongue color, overall energy levels. At its core, TCM is essentially this highly sophisticated, high-frequency tracker of a complex system's inputs and outputs.
This brings us to section 3, shadows of the same source, same body, different angles.
I absolutely love this analogy because it really clears things up. Imagine a single solid object sitting in a room. If you shine a light on it from the east, it casts one specific shadow. If you walk over and shine a light from the west, well, it casts a totally different shadow. All these different historical schools of TCM, like the Shanghan school that focused heavily on cold damage, or the Wenbing school that was all about warm diseases, they aren't actually contradicting each other. They are simply casting different historical shadows of the exact same object, and that object is the human body. They were just viewing it from different angles, living in different climates, and operating in entirely different eras.
Okay, let's totally de-jargonify this for a second. If a modern doctor sits you down and tells you that you have dampness in your spleen, you're probably going to panic a little bit. But here's the thing. TCM isn't actually talking about your physical anatomical spleen. It is using an archaic symbol to describe your entire digestion and energy conversion network. Dampness isn't literally physical water sloshing around inside you. It's a way to describe a metabolic barrier or interstitial fluid retention. And yin and yang, it's not magic. It's just a functional description of a dynamic state of relational balance, kind of like your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Once you actually translate these archaic metaphors into modern systems biology, all that seemingly mystical jargon suddenly becomes a highly logical, completely practical map of human physiology.
Let's map this out visually in section 4, the evolutionary tree from roots to leaves.
We can really think of TCM as this massive evolutionary tree. Step 1, down at the bottom, is the root, the absolute first principles of observing life. Step 2 is the trunk, those core logical frameworks like yin and yang that were used to actually categorize those early observations. Then step 3 brings us up into the branches, the various historical schools that had to adapt to very specific diseases and geographies. And finally, step 4.
But as we trace our way back down, we have to look objectively at those leaves, the historical records themselves. You have to remember, ancient doctors were operating in a ruthless free market survival environment. They literally could not afford to advertise their failures. Because of that, the case studies we have left over are heavily weighted towards success stories. We shouldn't be treating them like modern randomized controlled trials. Instead, we need to view them as incredibly potent, success-oriented clues that were passed down simply to ensure human survival.
And that brings us to Section 5, returning to the root, the core truths of life. When you actually strip everything back and reach the ultimate root of simply TCM, it promises this really profound simplicity. Before all the jargon, before the opposing historical schools, what were they actually observing? Well, just this. Change. Knowing that the human body is quite literally never static. Rhythm. Understanding that we follow deep, daily, seasonal, and biological cycles. Balance. The core idea that health is just systemic stability and disease is simply a broken equilibrium. Adaptation, our body's constant, ongoing response to stressors. And environment, the undeniable fact that we are deeply intertwined with our natural surroundings. That is the root. That is what TCM actually is at its absolute core.
So what is the big takeaway here? Getting back to simply TCM isn't about just deleting thousands of years of information, and it is definitely, absolutely not about rejecting modern Western science. Actually, it's about rebuilding the structure in our own minds. It's about translating those archaic metaphors into modern systems logic. We do not need to discard modern reductionist medicine. I mean, we absolutely need its precision to treat the individual parts. But we can use TCM as this incredibly powerful complementary lens to observe and regulate the complex, unbroken whole.
I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought to ponder after this explainer wraps up. Are we using complex medical concepts to cover up life or to actually understand it? TCM, when you strip away all of its confusing entropy, it isn't just some archaic medical system. It's a profound, beautifully simple way of looking at life itself. It asks us to stop just looking at the isolated parts and to start truly observing the connections. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, keep looking at the big picture, and I'll catch you next time.